What's in a name? If you're a fan of Shakespeare or took drama in 9th grade, I expect you to answer that which we call a rose by any other word would smell as sweet. Alternatively, if you're a fan of the Shins, you may soon return with they got a name for everything. Truthfully, it's of little consequence which answer you choose, because they mean the same thing. The former is a line found in the second scene of the second act of Romeo and Juliet, and the latter is James Mercer of the Shins referencing that same line 400-something years later. See, in the play, the phrase "what is in a name" and its accompanying lines are posed as an argument from Juliet. Comparing Romeo to a rose, she proposes that he would still be graceful and still be her love if he hadn't been named Romeo. If any other name had been given to him, had he not been born a Montague, she would not only love him still, but be able to love him freely. Something or someone's name is immaterial when considering their essence, their beliefs, or their worth. And in the Shins song Name for You, the phrase proposes the same argument, except instead of contending for the right to love someone belonging to a rival family, it argues in favor of female agency and against those who would attempt to constrain a woman's spirit by casting labels against them. No matter what name or label you give someone, their qualities remain unchanged. Same exact argument. Just in a different social context, on a different continent, in a different century. Point is, a name is to Romeo what setting is to Juliet's argument. It's inconsequential. A medium or setting is of meager significance when a moral is universal. And I don't think there is a medium on Earth more intimately acquainted with the idea of the same plots and characters and morals being endlessly referenced and resurrected under new names than film is. Whether it's Ridley Scott's Blade Runner or Aronofsky's Requiem for a Dream, film is an art form of rebirths. It is a Lazarus pit that we lower Boris Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago into and pull David Lean's Dr. Zhivago out of. From King to Kubrick, from Puzo to Coppola, film at its best is oftentimes just the retelling of a story that we've already heard, or that someone else has told before. Sometimes, though, a redux comes along so disjointed from its original that it's hard to tell it's a reproduction in the first place. And that's what I'm gonna spend the next however long I feel like talking cool about, so put on your thinking caps and strap in. I'm really smart, and this is why A Bug's Life is literally 7 Samurai. Pixar got its start in 1974, when the founder of the New York Institute of Technology, Alexander Shore, launched what he called the Computer Graphics Lab, and began recruiting other computer scientists who shared in his ambition to create the first ever computer-animated film. After sinking mountains of money into the department, though, the team realized they wouldn't be able to make their dreams a reality unless they found a home in a legitimate film studio. And that's when the big man himself, George Lucas, came knocking. 21 years, Lucas suffering from a financially crippling divorce, and Steve Jobs becoming their CEO later, their first feature-length film dropped to universal acclaim. Distributed by Disney and beating out their own film, Pocahontas, at the box office, Toy Story became a symbol of things to come from the new boys on the block. And later that year, production started on their next big project, A Bug's Life. And despite the film still turning out to be a success, it was nonetheless plagued by tensions surrounding its production, largely due to a feud between two warring factions. Never mind, wrong Kurosawa film. Anyways, ex-Disney chairman and current DreamWorks CEO Jeffrey Katzenberg had been told the entire original plot and approach of Pixar's next film by his once good friend, the leading director and head of Pixar's animation department, John Lasseter. Katzenberg, realizing the potential for the concept and not wanting DreamWorks to fall behind their Disney-backed opposition, had his team get straight to work on Ants, their own insect-based study of society and the natural order, where a young male villager with discordant tendencies relative to his people sets out on an adventure to save his land and woo its princess in the process.
And I just got through talking about what niggas trying to do, just not new.
Once it got back to Lasseter and Jobs that their old friend had taken the idea and ran with it, tensions quickly rose in the animation world and then erupted into a public feud. Katzenberg attempted to hold A Bug's Life's winter release date hostage so that it couldn't compete against DreamWorks' much-anticipated theatrical debut, The Prince of Egypt. In an effort to corner Pixar, Katzenberg even offered the production team in charge of Ants tremendous financial incentives to do whatever they could to make sure Ants was released first, despite Pixar's head start. Not only was Katzenberg and DreamWorks prepared to ruin a close friendship from his tenure at Disney, but he was willing to risk the success of what was intended to be their debut feature by moving Ants' release date in front of it to do it. Nonetheless, Jobs and Lasseter never backed down. Ants released a month before A Bug's Life, and grossed less than half of what A Bug's Life would go on to make at the box office, existing not only as a monument to the aggressive business tactics Katzenberg had learned from Jobs, but to Lasseter's resolve as a creator to stand up against a studio, even one ran by an old friend, to defend his work. And this is where A Bug's Life first begins to mirror Kurosawa's masterpiece. Not just in its first scene, but in the production of it. Seven Samurai was a technical and creative force to be reckoned with, a watershed within the world of film, and Kurosawa knew it. Through the use of, at the time, rare telephoto lenses, as well as multiple camera shoots, using diagrams to choreograph each operator's movements, Kurosawa was setting a new bar for every artist within the medium. Unfortunately, trailblazing often comes at a steep cost, and for Kurosawa, it was having his production shut down, not once but twice, by his own studio. Between the rewrites, the recasting, the meticulous set designs, and the overwhelming amount of time required to capture his vision, Kurosawa managed to nearly quadruple Seven Samurai's original budget, and extended its production length to almost 150 days of shooting, spread over nearly a year. Toho Studios, the production company that had originally given Kurosawa his start as a 25-year-old assistant director, had been financing Ishiro Honda's epical production of Godzilla, contemporaneously with Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, and at a tremendous cost. Finding themselves backed into a wall by the ever-expanding cost of Kurosawa's epic, the studio had no choice but to threaten him to rein in his excessive spending. Or else. Kurosawa, though, knowing what was at stake, ignored their pleas, forcing Toho Studios to completely halt production on Seven Samurai to avoid falling into bankruptcy. Despite the immense amount of pressure on him to reduce the length of his shoot and cut his budget, or risk losing all of his work, each time Toho shut down his production, Kurosawa simply went fishing and waited for them to ask him to continue his work. The reason he later gave for having such a calm and unfaltering resolve was that he couldn't imagine a company on Earth that would sink so much time and money into his vision and then not let him complete it. And sure enough, they asked him to come back. Twice. Kurosawa's faith in his work and his crew's determination to complete the vision they had set out to realize were fortifications against a siege of pressure to cut his losses and allow someone other than him to dictate the amount of time and passion put into his work, and when it should be released. But even if the conflicts during the production of their films and the public controversies surrounding them were similar, surely that isn't enough to call them the same movie, right? Well, like Gary Jones says in that pretty terrible Dead Rising movie, that's not even the half of it.
That's not even the half of it.
Yeah, that's where he says it. Now that we've gotten Lasseter and Kurosawa's parallel production perils out of the way, it's time we jump into the films themselves. Starting now. The films open with an establishing pan of the landscape, just outside of where most of the story will take place. We're ushered into A Bug's Life by a clement gust of wind, and the sound of insects and birds in the distance, the camera dollying forward like a leaf in the breeze that we're listening to, being carried towards the beginning of our story. In Seven Samurai, our establishing shot is scored by nature as well. The pounding of approaching hooves swells into the foreground, bringing a metaphor from the previous title cards to life. The sound of Kurosawa's figurative, thunderous downpour completely dominates the oral landscape for the first 30 seconds of the film, only relenting to allow us context. This is a village, and these are farmers. Neither the villager in Seven Samurai or the series of ants in A Bug's Life that we're first introduced to are proper introductions to a significant character within the narrative. But it is precisely this insignificance that makes their introductions so crucial. They aren't a main character. Rather, they are a criterion for the society that the main characters exist in, content to serve but brimming with fear. Both without strong leadership to defend them or free them from their chains of servitude. Reasoning that this alone isn't enough for us to grasp the true scope of their despair, though, Kurosawa and Lasseter each decide it's time to sit us front row for a full demonstration. And following a cut to this gathering of villagers and the colony's leadership, respectively, we're given a 1-minute crash course on the overarching despondency that rules over these consonant societies. In Seven Samurai, the villagers respond to proposals of hope with anger or counter propositions of suicide. And in A Bug's Life, there's no proposal of hope to begin with. As the queen explains to Princess Ada that serving the grasshoppers and leaving hardly any food for themselves each year is just the way things have always been for their people in one film, the villagers combat any suggestions of seeking help or subverting what they perceive to be the natural order in the other. And during this scene, in A Bug's Life, the sentiments of Monzo and most of the other villagers in Seven Samurai are condensed into the queen specifically. See, although these are essentially the same movie, the lengths of their runtimes are radically different from one another, and due to the almost 2 hours of time we don't have to be introduced to a dynamic cast of characters with unique personalities and differing means of responding to every beat in the story in the way we do with Seven Samurai, a lot of the characters in A Bug's Life take on multiple roles within the film. Here, actually, let me show you what I mean. So, protagonists of the film. I'm skipping ahead a little to their introduction, but the reason I am is because Flick, the main character of A Bug's Life, is Monzo, Rikishi, Katsuhiro, and in one scene, Kikuchiyo at the same time. He has the individualism and fighting spirit of Rikishi, but the fear and otherwise cowardly demeanor of Monzo. It's Flick's idea to seek out the warriors in the first place. On top of this, he places the warriors on an unrealistically high pedestal, to the point of borderline infatuation. His desperation for strength to defend his people, but simultaneous disdain for their subservient nature and the cycle that forces them to live that way, driving every decision he makes from the beginning to the end of the film. Oh, and speaking of infatuation, he's in love with the young, bright female star of the village that, despite his best efforts in consistently putting himself in harm's way for her, doesn't seem particularly thrilled with his presence beyond his objective use to the colony. Yeah, sound familiar? While Flick in this context plays the role of Katsuhiro, Princess Ada plays Shino. Again with the compression, though so does Dot. Weird, I know, but it makes perfect sense once you think of these two characters in relation to Monzo and Katsuhiro. The overprotective father relationship that Monzo shares with his daughter Shino is, at its core, the same dynamic between Flick and Dot. It just overlaps Katsuhiro's relationship with Shino, which is ultimately one of unrequited love. Katsuhiro doesn't behave the way Shino expects a samurai to behave, and when you consider her reactions to everything that happens between her and Katsuhiro during the film, it becomes clear that he's the immature damsel who's fallen in love and lacks experience, whereas Shino's just a farmer's daughter that wanted him to drop some samurai dick off and leave. The radical class inequality that ultimately makes their relationship impossible might be inverted in A Bug's Life, but the same dynamics are at play. Ada has virtually no romantic interest in Flick for nearly the entire film, and this is largely due to the fact that he behaves in pretty much direct contrast to what Ada wishes for a man in the colony to behave like, just like Shino. Lasseter throws Flick a bone by having Ada at least hold his hand and kiss his cheek before the ending of the film, sure. But when you consider the context surrounding it and the film it mirrors, especially in its closing moments as Shino is completely disinterested in Katsuhiro while Katsuhiro looks absolutely heartbroken in response to it, Flick and Ada likely have no chance of sustaining a relationship outside of the war that they temporarily came together during. And just like Shino, Ada doesn't have to. She doesn't owe that to him. That's what we call female agency. Shout out to K-Swiss for being ahead of the curve. Manny is Kanbei. He's the oldest and wisest of the warriors, but has now grown tired of what he does. De facto leader, but generally the most restrained of the group. Gypsy is Shichiroji. Loyal to Kanbei above others, and the screenplay specifies they share a close bond. In this case romantic, as they're a couple instead of old war companions, but it carries the same weight in terms of exposition for these two characters. Kanbei has calm and measured responses, while Shichiroji contrasts them with jovial warmth and encouragement. Heimlich is the other half of Katsuhiro, the least mature of the group even in contrast to Kikuchiyo, and at times he feels more like a liability to the group than a helping hand. Katsuhiro's metamorphosis from the young boy we met in the beginning of the story into the man we've come to know by the end is made literal in A Bug's Life by Heimlich breaking out of a cocoon following the battle and the other warriors pulling him along before the credits roll. Francis is Kikuchiyo, short-tempered but arguably the most emotionally consistent and well-meaning out of the warriors. Although all of the warriors are there for a noble cause, his manner of speaking and the way he carries himself alludes to the fact that he comes from a lower rung on the societal ladder, much like the ants. And it's because of this that he relates better to the children and the children to him than any other warrior. Dim is Heihachi. Although cheerful and upbeat, it's acknowledged by the rest of the samurai that next to Katsuhiro, he is the least skilled combatant, and that his use largely comes from appearing to be an imposing adversary, and being a warm, uplifting presence. Rose is Gorobe. Easily the most collected and easygoing member of the warriors, but a satellite character nonetheless, so her dialogue is somewhat limited compared to a few other members. Next in line to Kikuchiyo in terms of how well they bond with the village, especially when considering that Katsuhiro's bond was specific to Shino, and seemingly unreciprocated by the others in the village, especially Monzo. Slim is Kyuzo. Another trait of the samurai made literal, Kyuzo's exceptional swordsmanship is mirrored by way of the other warriors, usually Francis, using Slim as an actual sword. Kyuzo's reluctant demeanor towards combat and the killing of others perfectly translate to Slim as well, as he is consistently the least willing to fight and the most eager to avoid it. Thumper is Rikishi's wife, in that he serves the same narrative purpose, a symbol of terror and brutality that keeps the colony living in fear, a symbol they're familiar with. Gisako the Old Man is the queen, Mosuke is Mr. Soil, and Yohei is represented by the ant colony as a collective, consistently refuting hope, doubting the viability of Flick and Rikishi's plans, and in constant disbelief of their own ability to defend themselves until the apex of the film. And finally, Petey Flea, introduced to us near the beginning of the film and making his return at the end, sweeping the warriors away with him. Petey doesn't represent any character from Kurosawa's film. Rather, he represents the prevailing theme of the samurai within it. Hunger. Not just for food, but for purpose. Petey fails to maintain an audience, and when he is able to garner some appreciation, it's only through literal self-immolation. The samurai no longer fight for lands or for money. The time of the samurai is coming to an end, and the appreciation for them is limited at best. The threat to the colony was nullified, so it's all happy faces and music for the villagers. But the hunger is still there, and it takes the warriors away, because there's nothing left to feed them here. Anyways, after we're introduced to the black sheep of the village and the People's Court agree to send him on his quest, we cut away to our young protagonist setting out for the big city in search of protectors willing to defend the colony. Again, due to the contrast in runtimes, we don't get to see the Ronin Avengers assemble one by one like we do in Seven Samurai. But A Bug's Life still captures the essence of this sequence flawlessly. The flies yelling at Manny and the rest of the troupe, calling them washed up, as well as the group being introduced while they're performing as clowns for entitled and ungrateful onlookers, perfectly reflects the way Kurosawa introduces Kanbei, Kyuzo, and Heihachi to us. Resigned to lowly work for relatively little appreciation despite their ability. The feats they perform going largely unappreciated. Following this, when Rikishi and Flick return to their villages with their saviors, the people flee. Hidden in their houses and their canals, nobody, at least not at first, wishes to face them. Because they're afraid. The mantra by which they survive, the only rule that has successfully sustained them, is that their only choice is to endure. So they hide. Following the initial armament of the village, when Kanbei and the others are presented the armor of fallen samurai, hunted down and killed by the villagers after battles, is mirrored by the warriors being presented a tapestry, portraying the conquest that the colony expects from them, and their immediate realization that Flick misunderstood who they actually were. And just as we're shown the samurai silently retreat into their own anger and shock, we're shown the warriors trying to speak up through their disbelief and fear. The desperation in Flick's plea as he too realized what has happened, mirroring the anger and sorrow in Kikuchiyo's. And after this initial conflict, the films give us a brief repose. The presence of the warriors alone and their decision to stay has revitalized the colony. A sense of contented restfulness seems to have washed over the people within it, as well as the warriors. Their hope that was so long dormant, or perhaps never there to begin with, has finally been restored. And soon after the films lull us into this sense of warmth, the villages are attacked. Lasseter, not having the same luxuries as Kurosawa, an hour and 20 minutes of runtime to illustrate one of the greatest battles in cinema history, condenses the most broad, dramatic sweeps from Seven Samurai's timeless sequence into the last half hour of A Bug's Life. Petey Flea returns and proposes to the warriors that they need to return to his circus and abandon the villagers that they've sworn to protect, reflecting Kikuchiyo's decision to abandon his post out of hunger for purpose and honor. And like Kikuchiyo, the warriors come back. The crescendo of both films, the villagers and samurai in one, and the colony ants and warriors in the other, clashing with all of the spit and fire they have in them, against the duplicitous natural order that we were ushered into the films by, come to pass in the pouring rain. Shortly after this shared meridian, the films end, and a subdued wind carries the defenders off as the villagers begin their harvest. Kurosawa's greatest feats, his most overwhelming and formidable displays of filmmaking, to me at least, have always been his command of nature. His innate ability to elevate the natural forces of the world that his characters live in beyond a simple plot device or aesthetic pattern, and instead treat the rain and wind and thunder and fire and snow of his worlds as characters unto themselves. The opening sequences of both films stating before anything else that a downpour is on the horizon. In Kurosawa's, by the sound of the bandits' horses and the prodigious clouds looming above them, and in Lasseter's, by the first shot opening on a dried riverbed, introducing us to the colony as they discuss the coming of rain. Thunder being represented by the terrible crack of the muskets in Seven Samurai, and the harrowing screech of the bird in A Bug's Life. Weapons that pose a terrible threat not simply to one side, but to all sides of these conflicts. The roaring of fire, symbolizing the sudden rush of indignation within the villagers, as well as the sacrifices they had to make in order to contend the fate they had previously submitted to, expressed in A Bug's Life by the children narrowly escaping it, and in Seven Samurai by Rikishi's wife walking back into it. Both films usher us in and guide us out with rain and wind during a harvest. And both are, at their core, a meditation on the ever-changing natural societal order that we all endure under. An exploration of selflessness versus pragmatism, and an age long since past of personal honor and kind deeds being handsomely rewarded, closing with what at first watch may leave you feeling is an elated note to end on, a triumph over evil. But on a second or third watch proposes a much more gray and indistinct resolution. The villagers in the ant colony content to not further reward their saviors or even offer them a place among them, consistent with Aesop's fable of the ant and the grasshopper, which both films' screenplays were based on, proposing that the ants in the villagers are not victims. They are pragmatic and miserly, but only because nature dictates them to be. And the grasshopper, as well as the ant's brave defenders that Kurosawa and Lasseter and Tomioka and Roberts and Nugmanov and Sayles included, are merely products of the same order. John Lasseter's A Bug's Life may differ in the finer strokes. There may be changes made, cuts to certain character dynamics in the interest of accommodation for Lasseter's time constraints as well as his audience. But it doesn't change anything that matters. The broad strokes remain untouched. Sure, there may be a rift that separates them. 44 years of technological advancement, presented to a different society in a different setting, starring a different species, presented with a different name. But beat for beat, point for point, A Bug's Life is literally Seven Samurai. It's just got a different name. And after all, what's in a name? Hey, Thank you so much for watching my snappy video here. I hope you enjoyed it at least half as much as I did making it. Big, tremendous thank you to my patrons for making these vids possible. Look at their pretty little names flying by. Anyways, if you feel like helping me make more slick vids like the one you just watched, consider becoming a patron. Every little bit helps me make this thing a full-time gig. Subscribe, please, and let me know what you thought about what I thought down below, or on Twitter. Love you. Have a good night.